As a consulting historian, in 1979, as a personal initiative, he persuaded Eric Horwood to donate a major collection of more than 32,000 19th century and 20th century architectural drawings to the Ontario Archives. Steve revised Toronto, No Mean City by Eric Arthur's classic work on the city's 19th century buildings, and wrote two smaller books, Maitland, A Very Neat Village Indeed, in 1985, and Robert Wetherell and Dundurn, an architect in early Hamilton, in 2004. Fort York, and this is obviously very germane to what you're looking at right now, Fort York is Steve's present passion. He founded the Friends of Fort York and Garrison Common in 1994 and has worked to ensure that the Fort York National Historic Site has a prominent and vital role in the life of the city. He has been honored by Heritage Canada, Heritage Toronto, and the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. In 2011, his alma mater, Trinity College, Toronto, conferred on him the degree of Doctor of Sacred Letters, honoris causa. He was the recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal this year. And I'm adding my own notes to this bio that Stephen sent to me. Because of his tireless advocacy, Spacing Magazine recently recognized Steve as one of its 10 most influential people over the last 10 years, connecting him to a whole new generation of city advocates that we are all a part of. And last weekend, he was featured alongside such figures as Jane Jacobs in the Toronto Star's 180 portraits of people who have helped shape the city since 1834 in the Rebels with a Cause category. I think Now Magazine said of Stompin' Tom Connors that he's more punk than you'll ever be. I feel like they might even have something similar to say about Stephen. So, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I may thank you in the same breath for putting this presentation together for me. It's all on the internet. All the images are there for you to crib if you're doing projects. And I'll tell you how to get at them later. But I don't have the offices and the skills to do any of this for myself. Today is Toronto's 180th birthday. March the 6th, 1834 was when the city was incorporated. And only 40 years before that, it was carved out of the forest by John Graves Simcoe with his corps of Queen's York Rangers. So that this is a particularly important day perhaps to be talking about Fort York, because Fort York was, with the town plot, laid out at the same time in 1793-94. You'll know your history enough to appreciate that in 1813 the fort was burned to the ground by American forces and rebuilt starting late in 1813. What we have here is a view from 1821 of the east gate of the fort, that is the town gate, a watercolor, and there aren't so many of these that they're not special, each and every one of them. The fort is seen there at the mouth of the Garrison Creek. You can spot the ravine snaking its way down through the forests and woods, and the fort, a kind of triangular fortification at its mouth. Now today there's almost a kilometer of fill in front of the fort out into the lake, but then of course it was right on the lake. And it sat at the west end of the, well beyond the built-up part of the town of York, but there's a point there just north of that pier you see east of Fort York. There's a point there that marks the east end of the military reserve, or the Garrison Common. That was a 1,200-acre reservation of land for defensive purposes, and it gradually got whittled away and cut down, cut back, and one thing and another until we have today the fort at 41 acres and another 2 acres in Victoria Square, forming the Fort York National Historic Site from that military reserve. And the CNE grounds, of course, are also part of that. But we move on. Toronto in 1842 looked like this, and the fort, of course, sat off proudly to one edge, although they'd started to subdivide the area east of the Garrison Creek. I wanted to draw your attention, however, here to the open space along the front of the city. That was, by Simcoe's plan, supposed to be the walks and gardens. 30 acres along the edge of the water where the population could walk and enjoy themselves, and then it was continued, at least notionally, through the front of the Garrison Reserve over to Fort York. The walks and gardens are one of Toronto's great lost causes, because beginning in the 1850s, there were different assaults made on that space by the needs of the shipping industry. The lake was then the lifeblood of the city, and then came the railways, who did a coup de grace, and today there's 4 acres under Union Station that has remained in continuous public ownership since the establishment of the Walks and Gardens in 1818, but that's it. Fort York was getting to be old-fashioned and not thought to be particularly defensive in the 1840s, following the rebellion, when the British government then constructed the new fort, which was on the lake, where today you find the Stanley Barracks within the CNE grounds. But this is what it looked like when it was first conceived, bird's eye view by Thomas Glegg. And you can see at the bottom of this map, this plan, new barracks. That's the new fort. The old fort just intrudes slightly on the edge of this sketch. The sketch was done to show the lease of 987 acres by the Board of Ordnance to the City of Toronto for a western park. But again, another lost cause, and the Board of Ordnance canceled the lease in 5 years and said it needed the land to settle pensioners. I don't really think there were very many pensioners ever ended up enjoying the 987 acres that was there, but there's a hint in this slide, which 1852, the spring of 1852, why the Board of Ordnance may possibly have wanted to cancel the lease. You can see there the rail corridor of the Ontario, Simcoe and Huron Railway cutting across the Garrison Common, the Garrison Reserve, and coming in to connect to the Queen's Wharf south and east of the old fort. And the new garrison, of course, connected the old one by a road. Other uses were being cut out of the Garrison Reserve. The lunatic asylum, the provincial lunatic asylum up on Queen Street, 50 acres, known as 999 Queen until the last part of 20th century, when they changed the address to 1001 Queen and thought they'd escaped the bad memories. But the railways came in starting in 1851 to Toronto, and if you think technology is moving quickly today, by 1857, all the main rail corridors into the city had been constructed, and rail connections went to Montreal and to Sarnia and to Hamilton, Niagara Falls. and even to Berlin, now Kitchener. But this is the state of the Garrison Reserve in 1852, and you can see the subdivision on the east side of the Garrison Creek itself, Fort York, and there's the subdivision. Those familiar with King Street West and what a fine example it is of a main street, I heard somebody say this morning. We'll see it there between Brock Street, which is Spadina, and Bathurst, which comes down but is not yet punched through. It isn't, Bathurst does not come down to meet the lake until 1930. But you've got Victoria Square, a 2-acre park managed by the City of Toronto, and until 2011 still owned by the Government of Canada. But they were persuaded to turn it over to the city, and it's now part of the Fort York National Historic Site. Here's a last gasp of walks and gardens and a plaisance along the lakeshore, a sketch by John Howard, an architect and city surveyor, and you can see what they had in mind for the development of the walks and gardens, but he's realistic enough to show the railway coming in there from the left. He just didn't anticipate how it would take over the front of the city. Here's a later, slightly later, 1853 view of how the front of the city might be developed for both piers and pleasure. This was conjectural, of course, and I find it hard to believe it would have worked. But in any event, the railways were already possessing the front of the city. The Grand Trunk said to the City Council, "Let us cross your lovely new esplanade, or we'll build our tracks down Queen Street using our eminent domain," and the city caved, and of course the front of the city became railway land until recently. Around Fort York, the railways gave it a bear hug. You can see 2 lines on the north side of the fort, the Great Western to Hamilton, the Ontario Simcoe and Huron going to Barrie, and then clasping it on the south is the Grand Trunk. For a brief time, the Grand Trunk ran from Montreal to Toronto, then you got on a wagon, a vehicle or something, and you crossed the city and got on the western half of the Grand Trunk. So there was a station and there was an engine house and all of that south of Fort York, but the old garrison was effectively cut off at that point. In 1879, the City of Toronto got tired of taking the provincial exhibition on a 4-year rotation, sharing it with other places like Hamilton and Guelph and Brockville and London, and they set up on leased land the Canadian, or the industrial exhibition, later known as, of course, as the Canadian National Exhibition. And this is a bird's eye view from out approximately the bottom of Dufferin Street. You have the obelisk there, which is the Fort Rouillé monument near the bottom of Dufferin, and we're looking east. Fort York doesn't figure in that picture because it's so far east, but it's over there halfway to the smokestacks on the horizon. However, with this aerial view, which is one of the first from the air of Toronto, there were a couple of attempts in the 19th century to take pictures from balloons, but this one obviously is a biplane. 1919, you've got a flyboy who's learned how to take a plane up in the air, and he's taken along his Brownie camera and taken a view of the exhibition grounds from the air. The new fort that we saw, the sketch perspective of aerial perspective bird's eye, is off there on the right boundary of this image. But this is really, it's not a particularly good view, but the fact that it exists at all is a surprise. It exists because they were registering these views so they could turn them into postcards and sell them, and it survived in the patent office. There was a time during and after the First World War when another assault was made on Fort York, this time by the street railway. And on the left, you have the proposed location of the street railway running through Fort York, coming across the bridge at the bottom of Bathurst Street and obliquely through the fort and out through the west gate. That was turned down in a referendum because at the time the city's voters had the opportunity to veto spending, bond financed spending, and instead you got what is on the right and existed for about 15 years. That is, the streetcar came down Bathurst Street, came across the Bathurst Street Bridge, which at that time was on a 22-degree angle off of Bathurst Street, and the streetcar ran along the north ramparts, obliterating the ramparts in the process of being trestled and filled and one thing and another. And that was the condition until Bathurst Street was pushed through to Lakeshore in 1929 and 30. A better aerial view is this Fairchild one of 1926. Sherman Fairchild was a brilliant man, and he invented any number of things that we still find useful today, but the aerial camera was his first big contribution, something that you could take up in an airplane and get stable pictures. So what we're looking at here, it's not quite Where's Waldo. You can see the fort there in the middle left margin. You can see the Bathurst Bridge crossing at an angle. You can see Park Blackwell's pork packing plant sitting on the at the east end of Fort York, and that very narrow neck of rail corridors, rail lines coming into the downtown that cross under the Bathurst Bridge. North of the bridge are two gas holders. That property, known today as 28 Bathurst Street, was subsequently the home of a lead smelter, and has to be one of the more polluted properties in the city. And then along west of the lead smelter, in quite a substantial Italian building, was the municipal abattoir. And today, if you look from Fort York North across the rail lines, you can see that building built into Quality Meats. Quality Meats is the largest pork packer in the province, the largest purchaser of pork products from Waterloo and Wellington counties. It employs 800 and some odd hourly paid people every day. And so it's a very important industry in downtown Toronto, even though at times you do get the smell. Here's the way the railways were at the end of the First or Second World War. Jonathan's kindly put at the top the 20-foot long plan of the rail across the front of the city between Bathurst and the Don, and then an enlargement showing what it looked like just east of Fort York. But you can see how heavily the downtown was compromised by the railways, and passing through or over these rail lines was a challenge that we we met, but not handily. In any event, that was those are the railway lands which in the 1980s and 1990s were taken out of rail use and repurposed. Here's an aerial view from 1947, just 2 years after that drawing, showing the railways coming into the downtown front of the city. And you've got Fort York there sitting back of, I don't know, I won't, you can see it. And the Maple Leaf Stadium south of Fort York, and Little Norway south of Maple Leaf Stadium, the CNE west of it. Here's the intersection, and I gather the area you are looking at is just in the lower right corner. That's Loblaw's warehouse of 1929 on the lower margin. And then moving around clockwise, you've got Cross and Blackwell's building, Maple Leaf Stadium, Tip Top Tailors, now Tip Top Lofts, Molson's Brewery being constructed, and then finally Rogers Majestic's building across from Loblaw's. And the rail lines come in behind Rogers Majestic and Molson's. They also come along the lakeshore. They ran along Queens Quay, and Loblaw's warehouse was serviced by the rail lines from both the west and the east. You can imagine that that was a real advantage for them in their operations. The Gardiner Expressway, when it was first proposed, was not, I have to say, planned extensively, because they built it in sections. They would build a section and they'd, drop up plans for the next section. So it was built from the west to the east, and it came at the downtown part of the city as not an afterthought, but very much in the later stages. There was all hell to pay when it was proposed to run the expressway over a corner of Fort York, and if the Battle of York in 1813 was bloody, the fight over the Gardiner Expressway in 1959 was metaphorically damaging too. The expressway, as you can see here, was to connect with an extension of Highway 400 coming down through the city, and there'd be a kind of a clover leaf at the foot, and you would get on and off the expressway at Fort York. They made great efforts to show how the Garrison Cemetery at Strawn Avenue would not be touched, and how the fort itself seemed to be spared. But frankly, this was not something that should have flown, and in the event it didn't. Fred Gardner, Nate Phillips, and Leslie Frost, the Premier of the province, were beaten back by the strong opposition within the city to it. It did get built, of course, and it veered slightly around Fort York, and the engineers said, oh my, if people go more than 35 miles an hour, they're going to fly off the edge of the expressway. We can't really recommend curves in the expressway, but that was beside the point. They got curves. Your subject property is there just at the point the deck of the expressway ceases, and they're building out west of and south of the fort. And Fort York is there, but wasn't doing anything much. It had 10,000 visitors a year. 1994, when the Friends of Fort York, of which I'm co-chair, came on the scene, this is what we looked at. This is from the CN Tower, and the marks in the landscape of the railways are still there, of course. The land is still owned by the railways. The turnover to the city hadn't yet occurred, as I recall. And Loblaws also were a large owner of property there. They had bought the land immediately south of the expressway where Canada Cement had their big downtown batching plant. And they were a major factor in the push to rezone and redevelopment the land through Whittington Properties. That blue tarp you see on the near right is 28 Bathurst Street being remediated at a cost of $27 million. That only did half the site. The rest of the site's waiting for the next push. And then you've got the split in the rail corridor there. On the left side is the Hamilton line, on the right side is the Georgetown line, and that's the line that will go to the airport. Friends of Fort York moved along, did a couple of studies. You can find them on our website. I'll give you the website in a few minutes. But one of the things we pushed on early was to get National Historic Site recognition for Fort York. But of course, everybody said, oh, we know it's important. It's a National Historic Site. You know, since 1923, the National Historic Sites Board has talked of Fort York as a National Historic Site. However, they'd never taken the time to define it. And we got them to draw that heavy line around Fort York, which encompasses some 41 acres, and it has the advantage also of coinciding with the Heritage Conservation District municipally and the registered archaeological site at the provincial level. So we've layered our protections up, and it's got natural boundaries, the CN rail corridor in the north, the east bank of the Garrison Creek on the east, Fort York Boulevard on the south and Fleet Street, and then Strawn Avenue. So that's the Fort York National Historic Site, and it's been, I think it gave the provincial government and the national governments the courage to give a grant when we came begging for money to do the visitor center. We'll come to that in a moment. Here's Fort York at a happy moment. I think this comes from Spacing magazine, and Matt Blackett's played around a little bit with the green key, and it's looking very good. But you can see how it sits between the rail corridor and the Gardiner, and looking north, those Quality Meats is that large building on the other side of the rail corridor, and Bathurst Street running down the right side, 28 Bathurst, is occupied by two rather inconsequential buildings on the right edge of the frame. From the air, things are looking pretty good. This was taken in 2009, showing the development coming south of the fort, and the Friends of Fort York opposed the heights there, not objecting to the densities, but we took it to the OMB in 2000, and after 8 days of testimony and hearing, we were told that the developers and the city, which had lost its courage to back us, were going to get what they asked for, which is higher buildings. Of course, one factor here which makes for a happier configuration of the buildings south of Fort York is that the better views are from the south sides of those tall towers, so the towers tend to be higher as they go away from the fort, and that's not going to be the same story on the north side of Fort York, which is coming up for redevelopment. Now here in 2012, we have the development south of Fort York considerably advanced, and within the fort, I don't know how many may have seen it, an installation called the Encampment of 200 tents, each with a story of someone who had a connection with early Toronto within the tents. And it opened at 7 in the evening and closed at 10 or 10:30. It was quite a remarkable use of the space in the fort. It was part of Luminato that year. It's not something we can repeat frequently, but it shows the opportunity for that space in one sense. The Garrison Common, which is the area west or right of the fort, is now a venue for concerts. I think it's the 6th and 7th of June that Field Trip will return, and there'll be 25 or more thousand people out there enjoying a summer concert. And last summer we had 4 of those blockbusters, and it was the first season, so we think that probably we're going to have to get pretty good at that. Here's a demonstration plan for where Fort York is going. You can see the density around the south side. You can see the bridge that will be built linking Fort York north and into Stanley Park across a triangular piece of land known as the Ordnance Lands, because Ordnance Street is the core or spine of the space. And a long, narrow building there just south of the Garrison Road. That's the Fort York Visitor Center, now under construction. Pat Cow and Kearns Mancini, the architects, and your dean, former dean, Rick Haldenby, sat on the selection committee to sort out the 30 entries we had in an open competition to come up with a plan for the visitor center. You can see it's under the Gardiner. It's just under the north drip edge of the Gardiner. We couldn't build under the Gardiner Expressway, but we did take advantage of the drop off in land west of Fort York at the old lake edge. And there you can see how entrance to the visitor center is off one level, and you work your way up a ramp after you've visited the gallery on the lower main floor. Work your way up a ramp and exit facing the west gate of the fort, and the Garrison Common, the open space, is off to the right. I'm going to put in a plug here for anybody who likes to get free periodicals, but only once a quarter. This is the newsletter the Friends of Fort York put out. We think it's pretty good. We can't understand why everybody doesn't just sign up for it. And if you go to our website, www.fortyork.ca, you can sign up for it there. You will also find the link to all these images I've used in this presentation. So if you want to crib us, please do. And I think that's it, isn't it?